Hello, everybody. Zest here. Calculated Compression Collapse, The Crushing of Common Citizens, Part 1. Introduction, The Golden Mirage and its Merry Dismantlement. This series of videos will illustrate the most exquisite confidence tricks ever perpetrated upon a nation of willing marks. It examines nothing less than the systematic fleecing of the American middle class, a performance so masterful that the victims actually applauded their own destruction while begging for encore presentations. The tale begins in that quaint period, following the events of 1929-1945, when for a brief, shining moment, the common American worker enjoyed something approaching dignity. This era, which economists, with all the poetry of a mortician's handbook, have dubbed the Great Compression, 1946-1973, represents perhaps the most anomalous period in the natural history of American capitalism. It unfolded like a technicolor dream, with wages soaring, unions roaring, and inequality shrinking faster than an ice cube in July. For during these years, the fundamental law of financial gravity was mysteriously suspended. Wealth actually trickled down rather than up. It is widely remembered as a golden era, a period of unprecedented middle-class prosperity in American history, a veritable Eden of chrome-plated toasters and white picket fences, where the common man, drunk on the promises of hard work, thrift, and discipline, danced a jitterbug of prosperity and a comfortable life. During this period, the United States witnessed unprecedented economic growth, high wages, robust union strength, low income disparity, and a rising standard of living for a broad swath of its citizens. A time when Joe Blow could buy a house, send his kids to college, and own a Buick without needing to bet the farm or rob a bank. It was indeed a promised land of opportunity. But let us not be bamboozled by the Norman Rockwell mural slapped over this era. That prosperity wasn't the inevitable flowering of capitalist virtue. It was more like a ceasefire. This idyllic period, so often mythologized in the media and political speeches, was not an organic evolution of free market capitalism, but a temporary and tactical concession by America's ruling elites, a strategic truce enacted to quell widespread social unrest and regroup following the Great Upheaval of 1946. It was the result of struggle, union action, wartime state planning, and a tenuous post-war social contract forged under pressure. A hasty deal struck by an elite class staring down a barrel of labor uprisings, economic collapse, and the lingering ghost of Lenin. This period of shared wealth was not a new order, but a pause, a coffee break for the rich, while the poor thought they'd won the war. But as any magician will tell you, misdirection is everything. What followed, starting in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and beyond, was not simply a natural shift in the economy. Far from being a natural economic devolution, the destruction of this middle-class golden age was the result of deliberate policies implemented by American elites who viewed the post-war social contract as a temporary inconvenience. It was a deliberate reversal of this brief experiment in broadly shared prosperity. An intentional, multi-decade plan was executed to systematically dismantle this social contract, eviscerate the middle class, and restore a deeply stratified economic order. Industrialists, bankers, and their partners in the government, what one might reasonably term a secret government, or deep state, if you will, operating behind the scenes, saw the post-war period not as a new baseline, but as a temporary diversion from their preferred order. Through Federal Reserve monetary policy, the promotion of consumerism and debt, deindustrialization, and the creation of mythological narratives around the American dream, these elites systematically reversed the gains made by the American working class and restored the traditional wealth concentration that had existed before the end of World War II. In other words, this plan was implemented through coordinated cultural narratives, financial, and structural assaults, utilizing media, monetary policy, globalization, and debt as its primary weapons to transfer wealth and power upward. What followed was a restoration so complete, so artistically executed, that one can only tip one's hat to the sheer audacity of it all. The American plutocracy, having been temporarily inconvenienced by an outbreak of democracy and labor solidarity, proceeded to orchestrate the most spectacular wealth transfer in human history, and they managed to do it while convincing their victims that it was all for their own good. This series is no somber dirge, but a rollicking autopsy of how America's ruling class, those high priests of capital with their silk cravats and scheming smirks, pulled off a grand heist. To wit, the middle class's golden age wasn't the natural fruit of capitalism's benevolence, but a grudging truce, a momentary lapse in the eternal tug-of-war between the haves and the have-nots. What followed was no accident, no gentle drift of market tides, but a deliberate, multi-decade caper to crush the commoner's dreams under the weight of debt, deindustrialization, and a fairy tale called the American Dream. Let's peel back the curtain on this grand swindle. The 1946 social contract, a truce born of fear, not love. The Great Depression had exposed the brutalities of unregulated capitalism, leading to massive labor strikes and a surge in socialist and communist sentiment. It left capitalism looking like a punch-drunk boxer. The American worker emerged from World War II with a swagger, more emboldened. The war economy had pumped steroids into labor's biceps. It placed unprecedented power in the hands of organized workers, and returning soldiers demanded not just jobs, but dignity and prosperity. The American business elite of 1946, gathered in their mahogany-paneled boardrooms like a convention of pickpockets, were forced to return their ill-gotten gains. The war had ended, the workers were restless, and the specter of actual socialism was haunting more than just Europe. The year 1946 witnessed the largest strike wave in American history. Over 5 million workers walked off the job, telling their bosses to shove it. They were hoping for a share of the prosperity they had helped create. Picture it. 5 million American workers, newly emboldened by wartime unity, took to the picket lines. Industrialists watched this with all the calm of a man watching his trousers catch fire. The capitalist class, trembling like a chihuahua in a thunderstorm, faced with this unprecedented outbreak of working-class consciousness, did what any reasonable group of parasites would do when threatened with extinction. They struck a deal, a social contract with benefits sweeter than a soda fountain malt. But don't mistake this for generosity. The ruling class didn't embrace the worker out of brotherly love. They were scared witless of pitchforks, torches, and red flags. And so, under duress more than dignity, capital signed a Faustian pact with labor: decent wages, pensions, job security, yes, even weekends off. But if you think the Rockefellers suddenly had a socialist awakening, I've got a timeshare in Toledo to sell you. This was not benevolence. It was damage control. They gave up a slice to avoid losing the pie. Fearing chaos and revolution, corporate leaders and the federal government reached an implicit understanding with labor. Workers would agree to remain workers rather than becoming owners, and in return, they would receive a recognition of union rights, regular wage increases tied to productivity gains, secure employment, comprehensive benefits including health insurance and pensions, implicit job security, and the radical notion that a single income might actually support a family. The arrangement worked beautifully, producing nearly 3 decades of broadly shared prosperity that the ruling class endured with all the grace of a gouty nobleman forced to share his dinner with the servants. Thus was born the great social contract of the post-war era, a document written not in ink, but in the sweat of frightened boardrooms. I can't stress this enough. It is the single most important point in this series. This post-war social contract was born not from elite generosity, benevolence, or sudden recognition of worker rights, but from fear. It was a tactical retreat by capital, under duress. It represented a strategic accommodation by American business leaders who faced an unprecedented challenge: a highly organized labor movement strengthened by wartime solidarity, government support for collective bargaining, and the memory of the Great Depression. The financial elite tolerated this arrangement because they had no other choice. The elites were never pleased with the financial sacrifices required to share prosperity with the peasants of America. These elites, a coalition of powerful industrialists, financiers, and their allies within the government, recognized that their own survival necessitated compromise. High marginal tax rates, concessions to powerful labor unions, and investments in public welfare were not ideals they embraced, but sacrifices they were forced to make to maintain social stability and political control. But this golden era was always, from its inception, intended by these elites as short-lived, a temporary diversion. The situation in which labor's share of national income rose significantly and the wealth of the top 1% was diminished was an intolerable anomaly. Behind the scenes, a counterattack was being prepared. While the middle class celebrated its newfound prosperity, the elites were regrouping, planning, and waiting for the opportune moment to reverse these gains and reclaim their hegemonic control over the nation's wealth. In other words, this truce was less a handshake than a white-knuckled grip on the status quo. The elites, industrialists, bankers, and their pet politicians grumbled as they doled out pensions and health plans, their eyes already glinting with plans for revenge. They were playing a long game, pretending to bow to the worker while sharpening their knives behind the curtain. The middle class, lulled by full bellies and new Buicks, didn't see the trap being set.